The tough thing about adulthood is that it starts before you even know it starts.
Amid the white snow valley of Utah, where the pine trees whisper around a frozen lake, there stands a house once known as Robert Redford's Paradise. Back then, it glimmered like a Hollywood dream. Now, only the wind drifts through its empty corridors, and dust gathers over the faded photograph of a legend. But behind the roles that once captivated the entire world, Robert Redford hid another life. One filled with secrets, obsessions, and even same-sex romances that Hollywood never dared to speak of. Those who once adored the charming smile of the Sundance Kid would never imagine that inside that abandoned home lies a sorrowful truth, one that could tighten the throat of anyone who dares to remember. Robert Redford was the image America had always dreamed of. Calm, free-spirited, and carrying within him the light of the Western frontier. When he appeared, Hollywood seemed to rediscover an old spirit long asleep since the days of Gary Cooper and James Stewart. The elegance of the past, blending with the rebellious energy of a new era. In 1969, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid premiered and turned Redford into an earthquake that shook the film industry. Audiences weren't just watching a movie. They were witnessing the birth of an icon, a man who could make the entire world stop and stare. From that moment, Redford became the blueprint for modern masculinity, free yet profound, powerful without ever needing to flaunt it. By the time The Sting arrived, he was no longer merely a movie star, he was a phenomenon. The press called him the golden face of the 1,970 seconds, and Hollywood treated each of his appearances as a guaranteed success. But Redford was different. He was never intoxicated by the lights. While others chased fame, he preferred to stand behind the camera, seeking peace in his work, in nature, and in his unshakable belief that art only has meaning when it is truthful. But that was only the surface. Beneath it lay a world of contradictions and untouched secrets. Though he had a wife and children, Redford seemed never to have truly found himself within those familiar patterns. Somewhere behind his calm eyes and perfectly measured smile, there was always a distance, as if his heart belonged to another place, or perhaps another person, that the world had never truly understood. And perhaps it was that very emptiness that led him toward a special connection, a bond that Hollywood would whisper about for decades. Paul Newman. Few people know that in the archives of 20th Century Fox, director George Roy Hill once scribbled a note in the margins: "When they stand next to each other, the camera needs no one else." It was the first clue to a relationship that went far beyond the screen. It all began with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969. At the time, Newman was already a star, while Redford was a young, blonde actor fresh off the Broadway stage. Yet the very first moment they met, their gaze froze the entire set. Hill later recalled, "Before the camera even rolled, I saw them already acting." The legendary bicycle scene, the song "Raindrops Keep Fallin' on My Head," and that shared smile became an emblem not just of the film, but of a connection that transcended professional boundaries. One cameraman later whispered, "Between them was something no director could ever direct." During those grueling days of filming in the West, they never stopped teasing each other. Redford once recalled, "Paul hated horses, and the film required him to ride all the time. So I secretly loosened his saddle." That day, Newman had barely ridden a few meters when the saddle tilted to one side, nearly throwing him into the sand, sending the whole crew into laughter. Newman shot him a half-angry, half-playful look. "You'll pay for that?" Redford. Those moments, mischievous yet strangely intimate, convinced everyone that between these two men existed a bond no one else could break. When The Sting, 1973, came out, that energy between them grew even stronger. Behind the scenes, they often slipped away from the crew to smoke together, their breaths rising and falling in unison. Cinematographer Robert Surtees wrote in his journal, "They don't talk much, but when one of them smiles, the other immediately knows why. That strange harmony convinced everyone on set that between the two men existed a bond no one else could touch. By the mid-1970s, the press began to take notice. Life and Variety magazines both published photos of them together, laughing, lighting cigarettes, arms draped over shoulders, light glinting on blonde hair and blue eyes, images that many described as so beautiful they make you forget they're men. A lighting technician recalled, "During a break in California, they swam in the stream with the crew, wearing nothing but cowboy hats. When they laughed, everyone went silent. It felt like witnessing something sacred." In the years that followed, both men stood at the peak of their fame. Redford won the Oscar for Best Director with Ordinary People, while Newman received an Oscar nomination for The Verdict. Amid flashing cameras and applause, they continued to find each other late at night in a small bar in Manhattan. The old bartender remembered, "Paul talked a lot. Robert just smiled. When Paul left, Robert always stayed behind, staring at his unfinished drink." Between glory and loneliness, they found in each other the only kind of peace that felt real, the feeling of being truly themselves, if only for a fleeting moment. Then, one day, Redford admitted what all of Hollywood had only dared to guess. In a rare 1,990 seconds interview, he said, "Paul was the man I loved the most, not in the way people think, but in a way that scared me to understand." That sentence froze Hollywood in silence. Vanity Fair called it the most tender confession Hollywood has ever heard. From that moment, they were no longer called co-stars, but two halves of the same soul, a friendship that needed no definition, a love that needed no words. When Paul Newman passed away in 2008, Redford made no speech, wrote no eulogy. He only sent the family a small note, "I've lost the rest of myself." From then on, Redford slowly withdrew from the noise of the world. In his home in Sundance, people said he kept only one photograph on the wall, two men laughing by a stream, arms around each other, sunlight flickering across the water. No confirmation was needed, no label was required. Because perhaps true love doesn't need to be named, it only needs to live on, in the memory of two people who once dared to love, in a world not yet ready to understand it. Behind the stage, Redford carried his own private grief, the loss of his two sons, one after another. His first child, Scott, died at just 2 months old from sudden infant death syndrome. Redford was too young then to grasp what loss truly meant. He didn't cry. He just fell silent. And perhaps for the rest of his life, he kept living with that same silence as a way to breathe. Many years later, his second son, James, became a documentary filmmaker, a storyteller through light, just like his father. But fate proved merciless. James suffered from a hereditary liver disease, underwent 2 transplants, and passed away in 2020 from bile duct cancer. When he received the news, Redford withdrew from every public event, retreating into his home in Utah. There was no grand funeral, only an old father standing by the lake, gazing at 2 framed photos side by side. "When you bury your child," he once said, "the rest of your life is about learning to live with the emptiness." As the years went on, Redford longed more and more to live in harmony with nature. Sundance, the land he had purchased back in the 1,960 seconds, transformed from a hidden retreat into a symbol of cinematic revolution. There, he founded the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, a doorway for independent filmmakers, for the souls Hollywood had forgotten. Ironically, the man who fled from the spotlight ended up lighting the way for a new generation. Yet, the very place he built to save the soul of art eventually drained his own. In 2014, Redford became embroiled in a $1.57 million tax dispute with the state of New York over the sale of the Sundance Channel. Though the case was quietly settled, he remained bitter. "I spent my life building something beautiful, and in the end, they only saw money." Amid all the glory of his career, Redford was still the man, sitting quietly by a window pane, watching snow fall on the roof of his wooden house, wondering why the world kept applauding, while inside he felt only emptiness. Years later, in a small interview in Santa Fe, he said softly, "I used to think I was a storyteller. Now I realize I'm just a story slowly fading away." And indeed, as Hollywood rushed toward its digital future, Redford, the man who once opened the path for independent cinema, chose to stay behind. No resentment, no resistance. He simply returned to his wooden cabin in Sundance, where he once said, "If I die here, that will be a beautiful ending." And quietly, fate seemed determined to honor his words. The final years of Robert Redford unfolded slowly. He no longer appeared frequently on screen, no longer attended grand ceremonies, no longer faced the flash of cameras. Instead came mornings in a snowy garden, sipping coffee beside his wife, artist Sybil Chagars, listening to the pines whisper outside the porch. Morning light slipped through the window, resting on his silver hair and the time-worn lines of his face. In that peaceful frame, the man who once made Hollywood bow seemed to have found what he had always sought, perfect stillness. Yet behind that serenity lay a body growing weaker, and a soul increasingly alone. Since 2022, Redford has rarely left his main residence in Sundance, Utah, the very place he once turned into a sanctuary for independent film. Friends say he has grown frail, forgetful, but still keeps his ritual of walking through the woods each morning, gray wool cap, heavy coat, one hand lightly gripping a wooden cane. He speaks little, but his eyes remain clear, carrying the vast old sky of the American West. "Every time I see him," a neighbor once said, "I know he's preparing to say goodbye to the world, gently." That house, once a gathering place for artists and young directors hungry to tell their stories, now glows with only a faint yellow light each night. On the walls hang black and white photographs. Paul Newman, Meryl Streep, Sidney Pollack friends, who have already gone ahead. Redford often stands silently before them for a long while, murmuring to himself, "We've told the best stories we could. Now, there's only silence left." In 2024, he sold part of Horse Whisper Ranch, the property once tied to his beloved film, The Horse Whisperer. When he signed the papers, he simply said, "It's time to return to nature, what belongs to it." The words sounded light, but carried a quiet wind of exhaustion. It seemed Redford already knew his time was drawing to an end. Then came the autumn of 2025. The forests of Utah began to turn gold, the scent of pine resin and dry leaves drifting through every path. On the morning of September 16, he was found in his study seated in an armchair, notebook open, pen resting mid-sentence. He had passed away in his sleep, at the age of 89. There was no medical announcement, no grand funeral. The family simply confirmed, he left this world in the place he loved, surrounded by those he loved. News of his death spread across the world. Colleagues mourned him, calling it the passing of an icon that time could never replace. Meryl Streep called him one of the last lions of Hollywood. Barbra Streisand wrote, "Redford wasn't just a star, he was the conscience of a generation." Yet among thousands of tributes, perhaps only one old quote from Redford himself truly pierced the hearts of his fans. When you've told enough stories about freedom, there comes a time when you just want to live in silence. Across America, people paused to remember him. In Sundance, hundreds gathered around the small square in front of the theater he had founded, lighting candles and screening Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid on an outdoor wall. When Redford's image appeared riding a horse into the sunset, many could not hold back their tears. On social media, millions of posts appeared within hours, from young filmmakers to ordinary viewers who had grown up watching his films. Someone wrote, "Redford made us believe that a man could be strong and still gentle." Another simply posted a black-and-white photo with the caption, "The Last Gentleman." Movie theaters in Los Angeles, New York, Paris, and Tokyo all held a minute of silence before their first screening after the news broke. In Utah, fans who had met him during previous Sundance festivals recalled how Redford always arrived early, sat in the last row, and quietly slipped out once the film ended. Now, they returned to that same seat, leaving a wildflower on the cushion as if he had only stepped away for a moment. The death of Robert Redford was not loud. It was exactly like the way he had lived his final 3 decades, quietly, with dignity, and full of humanity. A legend passed away in his sleep, carrying with him an entire cinematic era, one where light didn't come from the camera lens, but from the man himself. And the house where he drew his final breath has now become the silent witness to a soul that once burned brightly, then slowly faded in the golden light of Utah's mountains. Amid the slopes of Provo Canyon, where the road to Sundance Resort winds through the pine forest, stands a modest wooden house by a small lake. Redford bought it back in 1961, when he was still a young, unknown actor, fresh off the Broadway stage. Driving through Provo Canyon, he once stopped by a snow-covered hill, looked down at the deep blue lake, and told his friend, "If there's anywhere I want to grow old, it's here." Soon after, he bought an old hunter's cabin and gradually turned it into a quiet wooden home by the water, a place he would cherish for more than 6 decades. In the 1,970 seconds, that house was the beating heart of the independent film movement, where Redford hosted open-air screenings and late-night gatherings amid falling snow. Every winter, he would light the fireplace, pour wine, and invite young friends over to talk about cinema. The scent of pine wood, paint, and guitar strings blended into the snow, an orchestra of youth and creativity. More than half a century later, everything has changed. After Redford's death, the house feels empty. The wooden doors remain shut. The long dining table still stands, but every chair around it is vacant. On the walls, framed photos with Paul Newman, Meryl Streep, and Jane Fonda now hang slightly askew. Outside, snow piles thick on the porch, marked by the paw prints of a lone wolf. There are no more film screenings, only the wind sweeping across the roof tiles, composing its own quiet requiem for the man who is gone. Locals call the place the Quiet Lodge, the Silent House. Travelers sometimes stop by the wooden gate, take a few photos, and move on. They say that at times, a dim light flickers from the west-facing study, even though no one lives there. Some believe it's a caretaker stopping by to clean. Others whisper that it's his light. In the forest, people occasionally hear the faint creak of a window opening, as if the house still remembers the rhythm of familiar footsteps. Inside, everything remains untouched. The large walnut desk, the fountain pen still resting in its ink bottle, a sheet of paper left unfolded, and a few unfinished landscape sketches. On the shelf sits an old Polaroid camera, boxes of black and white film, and more than 2,000 photographs of friends, mountains, forests, and Paul Newman, all faded with time, yet never discarded. In one corner of the room hangs a worn leather jacket, frayed at the shoulders, the very one he wore in Jeremiah Johnson. Beneath the chair lies a pair of dust-covered boots, as if their owner had just stepped outside for a moment. Beyond the main cabin, the property includes a narrow trail named The River Runs Through It, after the film he once directed. Nearby stands an open-air theater he built with his own hands, now used each year for memorial gatherings. On the eastern wall still remains an inscription, Redford carved for Sundance students in 1994. Art is not about fame. It's about staying human in a world that forgets how. Today, that line feels etched into the fate of the house itself, a lonely fortress of the artist's soul. Before his death, Redford handwrote a 3-page note to his family. In it, he asked, "Don't destroy this place. Don't open it to the public. Let it keep my breath as it is." His family honored his wishes. They didn't turn it into a museum, nor did they sell it. They let it stand quietly in the wind, like a memory refusing to close. Outside, the world still debates the fortune he left behind, hundreds of millions from his film ventures and environmental foundations. But in Sundance, the true value lies not in money, but in the dark wooden walls, the window frames mirroring snowy peaks, and the oil lamp on the west side that still flickers when night falls. Locals say that on windy nights, the lamp dims, then glows again, and they call it the Sundance light. Each autumn, when mist drifts across the lake, the Redford Grove forest turns golden like fire. People say that if you stand still long enough, you might see the figure of a silver-haired man step onto the porch, listening quietly to the wind moving through the trees as if he were still there, dissolving into the breath of the earth itself. And amid that landscape, his house stands solemn, silent, the last remaining body of a soul that has not yet left this world. From afar, through the pine trees, it looks like a frozen film frame, the lake reflecting silver clouds, the window glowing faintly, and silence draping everything like the dust of time. That lodge, beautiful, solitary, and eternal, is the final embodiment of Robert Redford, the man who left his spirit behind in the mountains of Sundance. Besides Sundance, few know that Redford also owned another home at Horse Whisper Ranch, the land tied to the film of the same name that he once directed. Lying about half an hour's drive from Sundance, in the Charleston Valley where the wind sweeps along the slopes of the Heber Mountains, locals call it the Land of Whispers. It is more than a ranch, it is a mirror of Redford's soul, where man, nature, and the memory of cinema merge into one. He bought the ranch in the late 1992, right after directing The Horse Whisperer, a film that explored the deep bond between humans and horses, between pain and healing. Much like the character he played, Redford turned this place into a sanctuary for his own soul. The Hollywood star became once more a mountain man, hands covered in soil, shirt faded by sun and wind, standing silent amid the whispers of the plains. Horse Whisper Ranch spanned over 30 acres, with old wooden fences, brown-painted stables, and a small pond reflecting the outline of distant mountains. The main lodge, built of pine wood, stood in the heart of the green prairie, its slanted roof blanketed with moss, smoke once curling from the chimney each morning. Inside, the living room was lined with cool stone, the fireplace darkened by years of use, saddle racks hung on the wall, and the windows open to a view that made everyone fall quiet. When Redford listed the ranch for sale in 2021, Utah's real estate world stirred. No one believed he would part with the land he once called the place of silence and renewal, but Redford simply said in a quiet interview, "I don't need so much land anymore. I just want to keep the part that holds memories, not the walls." The ranch quickly sold for about $4.9 million. The new owner kept everything intact, from the weathered wooden sign reading The Horse Whisper Ranch to the small bell hanging at the front gate. Yet, since Redford's departure, the land has felt hollow. Some say that on windy afternoons you can still hear the faint whinny of horses echoing from the forest, as if the old storyteller still lingers somewhere, smiling on the porch. And perhaps it is Horse Whisper Ranch, with its scent of wind, its horses' voices, and its endless silence across the open fields, where Redford left the gentlest part of his soul. A land that whispers softly, yet carries his name forever in the breeze. But before he became a Hollywood icon and a storyteller for an entire generation, Redford's journey began long before, in a childhood filled with wind, sand, and dreams along the California coast. In the mid-1940s, as America was still echoing with the sounds of post-war recovery, a blonde-haired boy in Santa Monica often skipped school just to run along the beach, watching waves crash against weathered rocks. His name was Robert Redford, a child whose eyes already carried what Hollywood would later call the look of freedom. His father was a quiet accountant, his mother, a dreamy soul who believed that nature was the only church worth kneeling in. It was she who instilled in Redford a reverence for the land, for the wind, for all the simple things people tend to overlook. Perhaps that is why, even while living amid the chaos of Los Angeles, Redford always felt he belonged somewhere else, somewhere he could breathe and hear the sound of leaves. His childhood was far from perfect. At the age of 11, he suffered a mild case of polio. Long days, staring at the ceiling, taught him early that the world was both fragile and beautiful. When he recovered, his hunger for freedom only grew. At school, he wasn't outstanding, just the boy sitting at the back of the class, who loved drawing and baseball, and who often vanished down dusty roads without warning. "I was never meant for walls," he once said. Then one day, he dropped out and took a ship to Europe. Paris, Florence, and months spent sketching on street corners made Redford grow not as an actor yet, but as a man who understood that art and freedom are, sometimes, the very same thing. When Redford returned to America, he carried with him the same old yearning to live close to nature. In 1961, he bought a small plot of land in Utah, simply, as he said, to have a place where I can hear the wind speak. But from that piece of land, an artistic empire was born, Sundance. And later came the Redford Center, where he and his son James helped hundreds of young filmmakers tell stories about humanity and the earth. Amid Hollywood's glare, Redford chose to step back and do quieter things. He devoted decades and millions of dollars to projects supporting environmental protection, education, and indigenous communities. A familiar face in the Natural Resources Defense Council, Greenpeace, and various climate change initiatives, Redford even spoke before the U.S. Congress, urging humanity to preserve the primal beauty of nature. He believed that we cannot, in the name of progress, destroy the beauty that taught us how to love life. In the years that followed, he established the Redford Center, a non-profit organization he co-founded with his son James, dedicated to producing and supporting films about the environment, social justice, and hope. The center funded a wide range of projects, from documentaries about climate change in the Colorado River Basin to green education programs for Native American children in Utah. Beyond cinema, Redford quietly funded art scholarships for young people of color, mountain schools in Utah's lowland regions, and initiatives to protect sacred Navajo lands. He often visited indigenous communities, sitting by campfires, listening to elders' stories, and then quietly taking out his wallet to fund small wooden schools by the mountains. His activism went beyond America. Redford collaborated with UNESCO and Global Green USA, advocating for ocean conservation and campaigning against nuclear testing. He believed every action, no matter how small, could ripple outward. "I don't do this for fame," he once said. "I just think that if I can change even a small corner of the world, that's already worth doing." Redford never saw philanthropy as an obligation. For him, it was simply another form of storytelling, a story about compassion, about faith that the world could still be saved, if only people learned to listen, to the wind, to the water, and to the quiet whisper of their own conscience. In his later years, when asked about his legacy, Redford smiled and said, "I just want the world to be a little greener than when I arrived. And perhaps, somewhere among the pine trees of Utah, you can still hear the footsteps of that blonde-haired boy, the child who once ran toward the sunset, never realizing that he would one day become part of it." Robert Redford leaves behind a vast legacy few artists can match. Unforgettable performances, a revolution in independent filmmaking named Sundance, and a spirit of artistic honesty that never wavered. But behind that brilliance lay the price of solitude, of loss, and of quiet years spent among the pines of Utah. He lived fully for art, yet had to sacrifice his own freedom to keep that flame alive. Was the trade freedom for immortality worth it? Or is that the eternal tragedy of every legend? If this story made you pause and reflect, leave a comment and hit subscribe, and join me in exploring more timeless souls of Hollywood. Thank you for watching.